depth of our culture, sport and creativity as a universal language that transcends differences. This will be a moment in which, along with its partners, Serbia will build bridges of friendship and togetherness, promote understanding, and open new horizons of cooperation. Serbia's way is the way of development, progress, and prosperity, and it is fully committed to becoming a full-fledged member of the European Union. This commitment, though, makes us no less devoted to promoting and deepening cooperation with countries from other parts of the world, maintaining and cherishing all along our traditional friendships and relations of trust in the East. Strengthening overall bilateral relations with key actors of the international community and with our European partners tops our agenda. Also, Serbia has raised in the past several years the level of cooperation with numerous countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and played in that way a respectable role on the global stage. I trust and believe that we can count on mutual respect and the traditional bonds of friendship with these countries in our future relations. Ladies and gentlemen, closing it and looking to the future and committed to dialogue and understanding, we in Serbia believe that peace is the highest value and the most solid foundation of development. We shall continue to invest our energies, knowledge, and will in building a world more just, secure, and worthy of the coming generations. I thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Serbia. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Hamad Al-Sharaa, President of the Syrian Arab Republic. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful. The Syrian story is filled with emotions, and it mixes pain with hope. The Syrian story is a story of struggle between good and evil, and between the weak right cause that has no supporter except God. Our story is one of the lessons of history, and it is an embodiment of noble human meanings and values in this eternal struggle between good and evil. We find the Syrian story that tells a new chapter of the struggle, one filled with creativity and determination and patience and torture and pain and sacrifice and clinging on to noble customs and values and hard work and relying on God. All these are tools for truth against injustice and falsehood. Your Excellencies, Mr. Secretary General, Madam President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, may the peace of God be upon you. I come to you from Damascus, the capital of history and the cradle of civilizations, a beautiful country that has taught the world the meaning of civilization and the value of human beings and coexistence, to be a beacon for the world. Syria, however, for 60 years fell under a repressive rule that disregarded the value of the territory it ruled over. For long years, we've suffered injustice and deprivation and oppression. Then we rose in claiming our dignity. The previous regime has used the worst kind of torture against our people, chemical weapons and bombardment and torture in prison and displacement and sectarian strife, and used drugs against our people and the world. It has torn our country apart and brought forth fighters from around the world. The former regime killed around 1 million innocent people and displaced thousands and millions and demolished 2 million homes. Ladies and gentlemen, the unarmed people were attacked using chemical weapons. Our women and children have inhaled toxic gases, all this to silence truth. And with all this criminality, there was no language for solution despite the offers. This people had no means and choice but to organize itself and to organize militarily to oust a criminal regime. It was a military operation that was filled with mercy and good and that prioritized tolerance and that did not target civilians. It targeted justice without vengeance. We restored our right and we became victorious for sake of our grievances. We were victorious for the mothers of martyrs and for all of you, people of the world, for the future of our children and yours. And we paved the way for the return of refugees, and we destroyed the trafficking of drugs. Accordingly, Syria has transformed from an exporter of crisis to an opportunity for peace for Syria and the region. Ladies and gentlemen, this unique Syrian achievement and the solidarity between our peoples have led us to try to uproot sectarianism and to fight against attempts to divide our country once again. But the Syrian people are aware enough to understand and to resist. We formed commissions for fact-finding and granted access to UN fact-finding missions. I guarantee to bring to justice everyone accountable and responsible for bloodshed. And in this context, Israeli strikes and attacks against my country continue, and Israeli policies contradict the international supporting position for Syria, which threatens new crises and struggles in our region. For this purpose, and in face of this aggression, Syria is committed to dialogue, and we're committed to the disengagement of forces agreement of 1974. And we call on the international community to stand beside us in the face of these attacks. Ladies and gentlemen, from the very moment the former regime fell, we set out a clear strategic policy built upon three pillars: balanced diplomacy, security, stability, and economic development. We filled the power vacuum, called for an inclusive national dialogue, and announced a government of competence. We strengthened the principle of participation and established a national commission for transitional justice and another for the missing, ensuring justice and fairness. We are now proceeding toward electing representatives of the people in the Legislative Council. We restructured civil and military institutions, dissolving all previous formations. Through intensive diplomatic activity, Syria restored its international relations and forged regional and global partnerships and achieved the gradual lifting of most sanctions. And we call now for the complete lifting of sanctions so that they no longer shackle the Syrian people. Investment laws have been amended, and major regional and international companies have already begun entering the Syrian market, contributing through investment and reconstruction. Syria today is rebuilding itself through establishing a new state, building institutions and laws that guarantee the rights of all without exception. A land of ancient civilization and culture deserves to be a state of law, protecting everyone, safeguarding rights, guaranteeing freedoms, and fostering life to flourish while turning the page of a wretched past. We are determined to restore Syria's glory, dignity, and honor. And in continuation of the Syrian story, I declare before you today the triumph of truth over falsehood. Truth has come and falsehood has perished. Syria is reclaiming its rightful place among the nations of the world. This announcement is the echo of a great people's will, a people who forged glory throughout the ages, who rose again from beneath the rubble to restore their rights and freedom and dignity. On behalf of the Syrian people, I extend gratitude to everyone who stood by the Syrian cause, who aided Syrians in their tragedy, and who welcomed them in their countries, and to all nations and peoples who rejoiced in the victory of the Syrian people's will. And I particularly thank Turkey, Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and all Arab and Islamic states, the United States of America, and the European Union. And before I conclude, let me affirm, the suffering Syria endured, we wish upon no one. We are among the peoples most deeply aware of the horrors of war and destruction. For this reason, we stand firmly with the people of Gaza. For this reason, we stand firmly with the people of Gaza, its children and women, and all peoples facing violations and aggression. We call for an immediate end to the war. In conclusion, the Syrian story has not come to an end. It continues to write a new chapter entitled Peace, Prosperity, and Development, and may the peace of God be upon you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Syrian Arab Republic. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Zoran Milanovic, President of the Republic of Croatia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for Croatia, the United Nations has always been a core, essential global institution. During our own struggle for independence, sovereignty, recognition, and territorial integrity, the UN played a decisive role. Our path to admission and early years of membership were about braving the stormy seas rather than smooth sailing. And it was this organization and what it represents, the principles of the Charter of the UN, that served as our safe harbor. I believe this experience proved productive for both Croatia and the UN and has provided many lessons for the future, including on how to successfully end a complex war and conduct peaceful territorial integration and reintegration. Today, the international community faces daunting challenges. Armed conflicts are more numerous than at any time since the Second World War. They are multiplying and intensifying, overwhelming humanitarian systems and eroding trust in our capacity to prevent or resolve crises. In Ukraine, we hope the senseless loss of human lives will end as soon as possible. We welcome recent diplomatic efforts and encourage inclusive dialogue that can restore peace. Beyond Europe, other regions faced devastating crises. In Gaza, tens of thousands of women and children, human beings after all, or before all, have been killed and are being killed. Millions live without safety, food, medicine, and basic human dignity. This is worse than a mere war. It's a carnage, and we urgently call for it to end, for safe delivery of aid, especially to children, and for the release of all hostages. Lasting peace can only come through the universal recognition of the legitimate political aspirations of the Palestinian people, long denied. Time to close the chapter. The suffering is in less visible crisis is no less real. In Sudan, one of the gravest humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century is unfolding before our eyes. UN peacekeeping must adapt to today's conflicts. Missions must be flexible, realistic, and sequenced towards achievable goals, reasonable goals. This requires the Security Council to focus on political solutions and remain committed to sustaining peace long after missions withdraw. Peace is more than silencing the guns. It requires preventing new wars and breaking the cycles of violence from the past. Lasting peace rests on democracy, legitimate governance, and full respect for the right of each people to freely choose their leaders and representatives. Excellencies, in our region of Southeast Europe, Croatia continues to champion and promote legitimate political processes as the foundation of progress. The EU membership is not a cure-all, but it remains a strong driver of prosperity, as can be witnessed in my country, Croatia. We promote good neighborly relations and urge all countries to refrain from actions that undermine stability in the region. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we call for full respect of the constitutional order, sovereignty and equality of three constituent peoples. All parties and the international community must uphold the Dayton-Paris Peace Accord. Respecting the right of constituent peoples to choose their legitimate political representatives at all levels of government is fundamental prerequisite of lasting stability and progress in European Bosnia and Herzegovina. Lasting peace cannot be imposed. It must be built. And if it's to be sustainable, it must include respect for human rights and development that is inclusive and fair, basic building blocks of any just and prosperous society. The humanitarian system must be reformed to respond with speed, innovation, and stronger partnerships with local actors. Croatia supports the UN's humanitarian reset in order to make responses more agile, effective, and grounded in resilience. Above all, strict respect for international humanitarian law must remain the moral core of multilateralism. In Croatia, decades after the homeland war, 3 decades, 3.5 decades, families still search for 1,744 missing loved ones. Not bodies, not just numbers, but human souls, fathers, sons, grandchildren still missing, unaccounted for. As co-chair of the Global Alliance for the Missing, Croatia draws on its painful experience to raise global visibility of this issue, share good practices, and strengthen cooperation. Survivor-centered justice is enshrined in our laws in Croatia, and we encourage the others to follow this path. We also share the Croatian model for searching for the missing. It rests on an effective interdepartmental cooperation and a comprehensive, transparent approach without discrimination, consistent with the highest international standards, of whom some are set by us. With this in mind, Croatia is proud to host later today a high-level side event on missing persons in armed conflict, dedicated to advancing the search for answers. Another legacy of the homeland war is the issue of landmines. Croatia has been active in promoting the Human Rights Council's first resolution on landmines, adopted by consensus on April 4th, International Mine Action Day. The resolution reaffirms the treaty banning anti-personnel mines and sends a clear message. The needless cruelty of these weapons violates basic human rights, violates the sense of humanity, the notion of humanity. The togetherness which is promoted throughout this debate especially means inclusion of the most vulnerable. Therefore, Croatia is proud to have led the initiative resulting in consensus adoption of an impressive 99 member states co-sponsoring the General Assembly resolution declaring the June 27th as the International Day of Deaf Blindness. Peace and security are inseparable from development and human rights. The founders of the United Nations acknowledged this when they placed these 3 pillars at the heart of the organization. As we mark the 10th anniversary of the General Assembly's resolution on the 2030 agenda, Croatia reaffirms its commitment to the SDGs and to ensuring that no one is left behind. We are grateful to member states for their support in electing Croatia to the UN Economic and Social Council for the 2026-2028 term. Our priorities will include accelerating the 2030 agenda, preparing momentum for the 2027 SDG Summit and the agenda beyond 2030, and strengthening links between humanitarian, development, and peace efforts. At home, in Croatia, sustainable development is fully embedded in our national planning. Croatia's National Development Strategy 2030 is closely aligned with the SDGs, placing us among leading global performers. We reaffirm our commitment to progress made at SOP meetings, including the landmark SOP 28 agreement to begin phasing out fossil fuels. COP 29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, must deliver a new quantified climate finance goal, and COP 30 in Belém must raise ambition, advance fossil fuel transition, and scale up climate finance. Croatia supports a credible climate finance roadmap. The triple planetary crisis also threatens global public health. Croatia endorses the One Health approach, recognizing the interdependence of human, animal, and the environmental health. We welcome adoption of the pandemic agreement at the 78th World Health Assembly earlier this year. As a Mediterranean nation, Croatia knows that health diseases are both a national imperative and a global responsibility. We remain committed to multilateral ocean protection under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. We welcome the outcome of the third UN Ocean Conference in Nice, France, have ratified the BBNG agreement, and urge others to do so without unnecessary delay. Croatia's contribution to development cooperation and humanitarian aid continue to grow. Since 2011, we have steadily increased our support, reaching record levels in 2023. We share lessons from our own recovery, from democratic transition to mine action and veteran reintegration. In Ukraine, our expertise in humanitarian demining is particularly valued, making us one of the leading contributors relative to GDP. Our support extends far beyond our neighborhood, reaching whole Southeast Europe, the eastern and southern neighborhoods, and Africa. Excellencies, fundamental changes we are witnessing in our world are not mere historical echo, but an all-encompassing global transformation. We are at the defining moment of an era to come. Emerging technologies are reshaping every aspect of society: how we live, how we trade, and how we defend ourselves. Drones are a clear example. They did not only increase the lethality of war, they changed its economics. They showed us that assumptions we held only a decade ago about defense and deterrence are already outdated, total bygones. This disruption brings danger, but also opportunity. New tools can be misused by hostile actors, spreading instability and lowering the threshold for conflict. But the same tools, used responsibly, can strengthen our defenses, improve disaster response, and drive economic growth. Artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, space technologies, robotics, each can be a threat or a solution. The choice is ours. We need to rethink security, not only nationally but globally. Rules, safeguards, and cooperation must keep pace with innovation. If they do not, we risk instability and peril. But if they do, these technologies can become engines of resilience and stability. The task is urgent. The world must act with clarity, not hesitation. Emerging technologies are not tomorrow's challenge. They are today's reality. And how we choose to guide them will define not just the future of defense, but the future of peace. Reforming the United Nations is an existential necessity. At 80, the UN must adapt to stay relevant and effective. We welcome the Secretary General's UN 80 initiative as an opportunity not only to celebrate achievements, but also to reform and revitalize the organization. Security Council remains essential. Its reform is at the fundamental. The Council must become more inclusive, effective, transparent, and accountable. Croatia supports comprehensive reform, including enlargement in both categories of membership and stronger representation of unrepresented regions, in particular Africa. The financial stability of the UN is also vital. All member states must pay their due, their contributions, in full, on time, and without conditions. Without predictable financing, mandates fail and trust weakens. The upcoming peace-building architecture review offers another chance to turn commitments into action. Croatia will contribute actively, emphasizing prevention, coherence, and strong links between peace, development, and human rights. We welcome the decision to provide assessed contributions for the Peace-Building Fund from 2025, but needs still outpace resources. Mr. Vice President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the UN does not exist for itself, but to serve humanity, to save and improve lives, protect dignity and freedoms, and advance peace, security, and sustainable development. On its 80th anniversary, we have a duty to leave to future generations a UN system that is stronger, not weaker. Croatia will continue to defend the principles of the Charter and international law, not rules-based order, to support multilateral solutions, and to build partnerships rooted in respect and responsibility. The world is not short of strategies and grand ideas, reports, or debates. What it lacks is political courage and determination. Let us find that courage together and prove that multilateralism can meet this moment and rise to the challenges of our times. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Croatia. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Nikos Christodoulidis, President of the Republic of Cyprus. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, we stand at the brink of a precipice. International order, as we noted, is challenged in an unprecedented manner 80 years since the United Nations emerged out of World War II. Today, we stand before drastic, unpredictable geopolitical shifts, instability that appears to spiral, and an uncharted landscape that seems resistant to the international order and norms as we know them. We are witnessing devastating wars, an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe, and human suffering, blatant violations of international law and international humanitarian law that bring our system to its knees. We stand before the rise of use of force against sovereign states that constantly escalate and expand, threatening regional security and stability. States are sponsoring Malayan actors to destabilize, disrupting critical maritime routes. The use of new means of warfare is rising without even the most basic safeguards in place. Global security is constantly undermined. At the same time, we are faced with the challenge of the uncontrolled expansion of technology and AI, threatening our security and the well-being of our children. And climate change is looming, threatening livelihoods, economies, creating new migration routes, and inequalities are becoming embedded. Our world is changing rapidly. And while there can be no doubt that the United Nations has served a noble cause and that together we have achieved tremendous progress, at this critical moment of inflection, we have a responsibility to recognize the shortcomings, to admit that we have lagged behind, that we have failed along the way. And these admissions need to steer us into action. We must urgently evolve to be fit to effectively address the immense, complex challenges we are faced with. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our moment of responsibility. Collective responsibility and individual state responsibility inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. The scale and nature of the challenges we face require both. Better together is the theme of this year's Assembly, but beyond better, we are also stronger together, more resilient together. This is the moment to renew our collective commitment and stand firmly and boldly in support of multilateralism and international law. Dialogue and diplomacy are the sole path to lasting stability and security. Dialogue and diplomacy over violence, each and every time. And most importantly, this is the moment to transform pledges into bold action, into change. Ladies and gentlemen, history will look back to this moment in time, and it will be unforgiving. It will judge us all, not by the declaratory statements we pronounce, but by the change we enable. We will be judged by the change we become as states, as governments, as leaders that have been elected by our citizens to deliver. Your Excellencies, my country, Cyprus, walks this path of responsibility, and it stands ready to step up further, to assume even more its role as an enabler of security and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean and the greater Middle East, as a driver of cooperation underpinned by a vision of strength through partnership with like-minded countries and a safe harbor in turbulent waters, determined to transform our geography in a complex region into a blessing by building on our long-standing historical ties with our neighbors that are anchored on trust, mutual respect, and cooperation, always part of the solution to the region's challenges as a credible, reliable, responsible partner. We have proven this time and time again. Cyprus will always be a stable, trustworthy, safe harbor. And let me be clear, this is not theoretical. It takes shape and form through concrete initiatives that build on Cyprus' role as a hub of stability and cooperation in a challenging part of the world. Cyprus has consistently provided the necessary infrastructure and support for the evacuation of foreign nationals from areas of danger or conflict, from Sudan, from Lebanon, from Israel, from Iran. Following the barbaric Hamas terrorist attack of October 7 and the subsequent war that has led to a humanitarian tragedy in Gaza, Cyprus assumed yet again its moral responsibility to its region. We did so through the development of the Amalthea Maritime Corridor for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Gaza. The route was reactivated as recently as this past week. We worked with like-minded partners, the United Arab Emirates, the United States, the European Union, the UK, and others, and yes, we deliver. Furthermore, in the face of persecutions in the region towards religious and other minorities, Cyprus couldn't remain idle, proving our long-standing commitment to upholding fundamental rights and freedoms, demonstrating once again responsibility. We appointed a special envoy on the protection of religious freedom and the protection of minorities in the Middle East. At the same time, my country has responded to the calls of our neighbors for assistance in the face of fires, sending our brave firefighters as reinforcement, and our neighbors have reciprocated. Also, as a part of our regional responsibility in addressing climate change, Cyprus and Jordan's proposed initiative for a European firefighting hub in Cyprus, covering our region, is now in the path of implementation by the European Union. And the aforementioned example, dear friends, are only a snapshot of Cyprus's active, tangible responsibility. And I'm very proud that my country walks this path of responsibility, and we are determined to expand it, always part of the solution and never part of the problem. Your Excellencies, Cyprus stands ready to assume its regional responsibility also in the context of bringing an end to the war in Gaza, and given our proximity, to play a role in its reconstruction. Let me be clear, there are no substitutes for peace. This war must end. A first necessary step is the immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and I really hope that President Trump's initiative has a positive outcome. At the same time, the humanitarian catastrophe must be alleviated. This means unhindered flow of aid in Gaza. The displacement must also end. International humanitarian law must be respected. We also call with the same fervor for the immediate release of all hostages. And, dear friends, as unreachable as it may seem at this moment, we must not lose sight of the path for peace, for a two-state solution in line with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. We have a responsibility to continue our work for a future in which Israel and Palestine live side by side in conditions of lasting security and peace. And we must be clear and unequivocal that Hamas, a terrorist organization, has no place in such a future. Your Excellencies, as part of our responsibility, my country will assume the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union in January of 2026. The European Union that has evolved into an unprecedented political union embodying the essence of multilateralism anchored on respect for the UN Charter. It is a project of collective responsibility that delivers a unifying force of stability, security, and prosperity. And the European Union presidency is yet another moment of responsibility for Cyprus. Europe's heart will beat for 6 months from the Union's last divided member state under occupation since the 1974 Turkish invasion. We will exercise our responsibility fully aware of what is at stake. An imperative need to deliver stronger multilateralism, more integration and more cooperation between Europe and the world. To deliver a stronger, more secure, more autonomous European Union, committed to supporting partners focusing also on the Eastern Mediterranean and the greater Middle East, supporting and investing in strategic partners that are pillars of stability in the region, such as Egypt and Jordan, working together with our Lebanese partners to ensure long-lasting stability in the country, working to ensure stability in Syria, inclusivity, respect to religious freedoms, and of course, protection of minorities, assuming more responsibility as a union for our security, but also for our neighborhood. Ladies and gentlemen, Cyprus will assume another role of responsibility for the first time in its history as a member of the Human Rights Council for the period 2025-27. It is in the same spirit that we also proudly presented our candidature for the presidency of the 81st session of the UN General Assembly, as a member state that embodies and embraces the principles of multilateralism, inclusivity, bridge building, and of course responsibility. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the Russian aggression against Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter must serve as a wake-up call. As we condemn the use of force against a sovereign nation, the killing of civilians, the forced disappearance of children, the destruction and displacement, we have an obligation to remember. We must collectively act against aggressor, no matter who they are. Appeasing the aggressor never yields results, and history demonstrates this very clearly. Each time we turn a blind eye to violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states anywhere in the world, we create space and opportunity for the next aggressor. And this time, it can be bordering your country. In 2022, Russia invaded a sovereign nation, Ukraine, violating the UN Charter. In 1974, Turkey invaded a sovereign nation, Cyprus, violating the UN Charter. The violation is equal: the suffering, the invasion, and the occupation. My country, Cyprus, is under Turkish occupation for 51 years. Tens of thousands displaced, women raped, destruction of cultural and religious heritage, the fenced town of Varosha held hostage by Turkey, awaiting for its lawful inhabitants to return as the relevant UN Security Council resolutions have prescribed for Turkey to allow. A policy of illegal settlements to change the demographic character of the country. Families, 51 years later, waiting for the fate of their loved ones. As a young boy in those early years after the invasion, the images of mothers and children weeping for their loved ones have been engraved in my memory. Dear friends, the playbook of occupiers is always the same. Your Excellencies, from this very podium yesterday, Mr. Erdogan preached the word on peace and accountability. He pointed the finger to others for crimes Turkey itself commits every single day. That is selective sensitivity and hypocrisy of the highest form. Illegality cannot yield legality. Illegality stemming from use of force cannot be recognized, no matter who is the perpetrator is, no matter who the victim is. Ladies and gentlemen, politicians are judged not by their words, but by their actions. It is what distinguishes politicians from leaders. Cyprus has proven time and again that it is a reliable, responsible actor. A country that not only talks the talk, but also walks the walk of responsibility. And my call to Mr. Erdogan is to join that path of responsibility, to end the occupation through negotiations for a comprehensive settlement that will reunify Cyprus in a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality, always in line with UN Security Council resolutions, European Union law, values, and principles. This is the only way. Therefore, let me repeat, the call for responsibility is the loudest for my own country. I'm ready for this moment of responsibility, ready to deliver on the call of history to reunify Cyprus, to reunify my people, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Maronites, Armenians, and Latins. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, we stand at the brink of a precipice. And while the impulse may be to shrink away from the immense responsibility we inherited from the visionaries who stood here 80 years ago, now is the moment for us to assume our responsibility collectively and individually as states. Rest assured that my country, Cyprus, will continue to do its part by being responsible, by being advocates for responsibility, for the good of humanity, for our peoples. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Cyprus. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Alexander Stubb, President of the Republic of Finland. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in its simplest form, foreign policy is really about three things: about values, interests, and power. I come from a relatively small country, Finland, and our toolkit is mainly about two of those three things. It's about values and interests. Power, hard or soft, is usually the luxury of bigger players. The power of smaller country arises from its capacity to cooperate with others. Smart diplomacy gives smaller player at least relative influence. The UN is, of course, case in point. Big players have power through their permanent membership in the UN Security Council. But we, the smaller players, can influence the ebb and flow of international relations by being active in the corridors of diplomacy. Now, most of the speeches that we've heard here today have highlighted the fact that the world order, balance, and dynamics are changing, much like they did after World War II when the UN was founded. I actually think that the post-Cold War order is over, but we don't know what the new order is going to look like. it will take at least 5 to 10 years for things to settle. And my message to this assembly today is that regardless of the size, each and every member state of the United Nations has agency, a say in how the new world order will look like. It is important that we all use this power wisely and responsibly. Now, I fully appreciate that our interests differ, depending on our geographical location, history, state of development, or culture. But fundamental values are something we should all share. We have commonly defined some of the most essential of them in the UN Charter. Today, I want to do 2 things. First, analyze where we are, and second, give my proposals on what we might want to do together. To understand what's currently happening in the world, I'd like to raise 3 different but yet related developments. First, it seems to me that there's a growing tension between multilateralism, in other words, an order based on the rule of law, and those that speak the language of multipolarity or transactionalism. So difference between multilateralism and multipolarity. Now, I can understand the temptation and the rationale of the proponents of multipolarity and transactionalism. But can they solve the world's biggest challenges, such as climate change or sustainable development? Today, I see many states, both big and small, pursuing transactional or multivectoral foreign policies. In essence, their aim is to diversify their relations with multiple actors rather than aligning with any one particular bloc. Now, this can be opportunistic, but it may also be justified and reasonable. This depends on political choices. A transactional or multivectoral foreign policy is dominated by interests. Interests drive practical choices of states, and this is entirely legitimate. This kind of foreign policy is based on a realistic understanding of power. Power defines the limits of what is possible for each state. However, values should actually underpin everything we do. Even transactional or multivectoral foreign policy should rest on a score of fundamental values. Without them, foreign policy will ultimately run into a wall. If you set aside values for unhindered pursuit of power and interests, you will eventually find before you the very same problems you wanted to overlook. Second, the balance of power in the New World Order is shifting towards the South and the East. Many countries, especially in Africa, Asia, Latin America, are becoming or have become key players in determining the direction of the New World Order. To put it simply, they have both agency and power. They are not only an expanding economic force, but their demographic growth is inexorable. This will also turn them into a political and cultural force. It will yield them both hard power and soft power, and they will use it to promote their interests as they should. The 193 members of the United Nations do not have to agree on every minute detail of values, but we have to have a common understanding of fundamentals. They include the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. They include the prohibition of the use of force and the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. These values are the building blocks of who we are and what we stand for as the United Nations. The broad international community has overwhelmingly an interest to uphold them. Let me be clear. Russia has no right to continue its aggression on Ukraine. Israel has no right to violate international law in Palestine. States have no right to use Sudanese or Congolese territories to fight proxy wars for their economic or strategic self-interests. I urge us all to heed this message of the international community and act accordingly. War is always a failure of humanity. It is a collective failure of our fundamental values. It is a failure of us as human beings. Thirdly, I would like to say a few words about the state of the United Nations, the institution where we are. The UN was created to maintain and promote peace, stability, development, and friendly relations among nations. In order to achieve this, the balance between the three elements was required. The power at the highest level was represented by the UN Security Council. The interests of the wider membership were reconciled here in the General Assembly, and the values were enshrined in the Charter and consolidated as rules of international law. Now, unfortunately today, the UN is struggling to fulfill its central promise of delivering peace and stability. We can always blame each other, but at the end of the day, it's a collective decision. Countries have increasingly taken the liberty to break the rules of international law and to use force against other people's territories and suppress other nations. The United Nations of today does not sufficiently reflect the realities of the balance of power. All too often, it fails to serve as a forum for the coordination of interests, and the values at its core are too often not respected in good faith. We all want to have the freedom to make choices and a possibility to influence the world around us. Today, many countries are seeking answers in multipolarity or transactionalism. If the UN fails to deliver, this trend will accelerate. So, let me sum up in the terms of the three pillars: values, interests, and power. Our values can divide us. Fundamentally, however, they should unite us around the basic principles of humanity, the rule of law, and the prohibition of aggression. Our interests differ, and it's only right that we promote them. However, our choices have consequences. Opportunism will eventually be forced to confront the problems it tried to ignore. Power will constantly seek a new balance. We must adapt to change. Nevertheless, we should not allow the rise of hard power to blind us. The power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong. So let me get to my second part, from the situation to possible solutions or things that we could do together. Never before in history has humankind had such means of innovations at its disposal to solve the world's most pressing problems. However, the current direction is wrong in so many ways. There are more wars than at any time since World War II. The world is becoming increasingly divided. And so are our societies, and the measures to deal with climate change and sustainable development are lagging behind. In different parts of the world, we're witnessing immense civilian suffering and blatant disrespect for humanitarian principles. For me as a Finn, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine not only reminds me of our past, but is directly linked to the security of the part of the world where I live. On the other hand, there is aggression and total disregard for civilian life, and an attempt to undermine the fundamental principles on which the international order is based. On the other hand, there's a bastion of freedom that is defending its right to exist and to make its own choices. The battle for what consequences we will draw from this aggression is not yet over. Recently, there's been serious attempts at diplomatic solutions of the war on the initiative of the United States. There are no perfect solutions to wars. At the same time, we know that any decision made in these matters will have far-reaching consequences in Ukraine and beyond. There can hardly be a stronger unifying interest among the UN's broad membership than our opposition to the wars of conquest. Aggression must not be rewarded. Accountability for the most serious international crimes must be pursued. In the Middle East, civilians in Gaza are experiencing immense suffering. The deepening humanitarian crisis has reached unbearable levels and represents a failure of the international system. At the same time, Hamas continues to hold the hostages it has taken, and many have already lost their lives. An immediate ceasefire is needed in Gaza. That has been reiterated from this podium many times today and yesterday. Humanitarian aid must be granted safe and unhindered access. The hostages must be released. I commend the efforts led by France and Saudi Arabia to advance the two-state solution. The negotiations must meet the Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian right to self-determination, its legitimate aspiration for statehood and sovereignty. The occupation that began in 1967 must end, and all permanent status issues must be resolved. Correspondingly, the countries that have not recognized Israel must do so. At the same time, the international community must support and strengthen the Palestinian Authority for it to govern the entire Palestinian territory effectively. This is the only viable option for achieving a two-state solution. A stable Palestine will also significantly benefit the security of Israel. In many parts of the world, conflicts are raging, causing immense suffering locally, instability regionally, and reverberations globally. We've witnessed particularly brutal violence in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Haiti, Myanmar, and Mali, among others. Civilian populations continue to face famine and displacement at a large scale. And sometimes I feel that we end up looking at conflicts only that are near to us. But I think the job of the UN is to look at all of them with equal determination. I praise all those who, in good faith, continue to work for peace despite the daunting task. In June, a peace agreement was reached for the conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The true test, like with all peace agreements, lies in its implementation. Does it stick? There's a humanitarian crisis of alarming proportions that compels us, all of us, to respond. Peace processes should not be transactional. They must be guided by international law. All countries and stakeholders in the region must be engaged and committed to achieve sustainable peace. The presence and involvement of the UN is essential. I would also like to stress the crucial work carried out by journalists amid conflicts and in other difficult circumstances. Attacks on members of the media are unacceptable. Media freedom is the basis for democracy. It is a prerequisite for an open society. The ability of the press to carry out its work is important for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, the composition of the UN still largely reflects the world of 1945. As the world has changed drastically, so should the decision-making at the UN. Last year, in this very hall, I argued for a reformed Security Council, a council where currently underrepresented regions would have a stronger voice through permanent seats at the table. The number of permanent members should be increased in the UN Security Council. At least there should be 2 new seats for Asia, 2 for Africa, and 1 for Latin America. I think I'm going to say this every year because it's the only place where I get applause. No single state should have a veto power. And if a member of the Security Council violates the UN Charter, its voting rights should be suspended. I believe that these changes at the top of the UN are necessary in order to maintain the UN's central role in international relations. At the same time, a more comprehensive reform of the UN is needed. I commend the Secretary General for his UN 80 initiative, and I encourage him to take bold and ambitious action. So Finland strongly supports the UN and wants it to succeed. Therefore, we stress the need for true reform to enhance the organization's credibility, relevance, and efficiency. This will ensure that the UN can act. The UN needs to focus its efforts on its most important goals: ending and preventing wars, protecting human rights, and acting as a catalyst for sustainable development. And also, we need to get the UN back into peace mediation. I would argue that one of the reasons that we have so many wars right now is that the UN is absent from peace mediation. No other organization can offer the legitimacy comparable to that of the UN. If the UN is absent, conflicts are not resolved without it, which is not in our common interests. The UN is needed as a mediator, and the member states should support it at this endeavor. Finally, Finland is strongly engaged in the work of the UN and will remain so. Therefore, we're also standing for election to the Security Council for the term of 2029 to 2030. Should we be elected, Finland pledges to be a principled and pragmatic partner for peace. We are principled in our commitment to international law with the Charter at its core. We are pragmatic in seeking solutions that truly advance international peace and security, recognizing that progress is often incremental. At the outset of my speech, I said that each and every one of us has agency, a say how the new world order will look like. We want to be able to make our own choices and have an impact on the world around us. Nelson Mandela saw truth and reconciliation as the only hope for nations that are bitterly divided. The same applies to relations between states. We should learn from history, but always look to the future, bearing in mind that our decisions will shape it. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Finland. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
President of the General Assembly, the Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock on her election as President of the General Assembly to lead this historic 80th session of the General Assembly. I thank her predecessor, His Excellency Philemon Young, for his distinguished leadership during the 79th session. I commend the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his steadfast commitment to the ideas of the United Nations during these increasingly turbulent times. Madam President, it's both an honor and a solemn responsibility to address this Assembly on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. This assembly is not just ceremonial. It is a call for the world's conscience to act with unity, determination, and vision. Our theme, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights, both celebrates and summons. It reminds us that cooperation delivers progress. It also demands that we reimagine multilateralism so that peace, dignity, and equality are not promises on paper, but realities in the lives of people. This anniversary is not a time for complacency, but for courageous renewal. Today, we face deepening inequalities, climate crises, geopolitical fragmentation, technological disruptions, and entrenched conflict. No nation can meet these challenges alone. We need bold multilateralism and a united nations that is not only reformed, but reinvigorated. The UN must be more than a meeting place. It must be a working place for people, for peace, and for our planet. Madam President, Sierra Leone is a small state that has relied heavily on the United Nations chapter and now helps to uphold it. We speak with independence and conviction because we have lived the cost of its absence. I also serve as chair of ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government and coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government on Security Council Reform, C10. For both myself and the people of Sierra Leone, these roles are not just titles, they are responsibilities. They reflect Sierra Leone's conviction that principled multilateralism is the surest defense of law, equity, and peace. Since 1945, the Charter's promise of sovereign equality, non-aggression, and human dignity have been the bedrock of small states like ours. In 1961, when Sierra Leone first addressed this assembly, our founding Prime Minister, Sir Milton Magai, pledged that our voice would be independent and principled, guided not by bitterness, but by conviction. That pledge remains our compass. We stand for justice and equality. We uphold the rights of all people to self-determination. We speak truth. We speak truth to power and act in defense of humanity and the rule of law. Small states are not inherently small. Our sovereignty is equal and our responsibilities are the same. Leadership is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the clearest voice for justice. Madam President, our current term on the UN Security Council has deepened these convictions. Guided by the Charter, we have championed peace through dialogue, upheld international law, and promoted prevention as the first duty of collective security. We have supported efforts to stabilize Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, de-escalated tensions in the Middle East, and supported political transition in Lebanon and Syria for peace and stability. We have also seen the Security Council's limits, its paralysis in the face of grave human suffering. Nowhere has this failure been heart-wrenching than in Gaza. A preventable genocide was not prevented. Mass starvation that could have been avoided was not avoided. A broadly supported two-state solution has been obstructed by division and inaction. We therefore welcome all member states that have recently announced their long overdue recognition of the State of Palestine. Yet, much more remains to be done. We must bring an end to the war and ensure the release of all hostages and prisoners. Sierra Leone has not wavered. We have spoken with independence, voted with principle, and pressed for urgent action to end atrocities and revive hope. We say again, cease fire now in Gaza. Cease fire now in Sudan. Cease fire now in Ukraine. These are not just slogans. They are calls to conscience, calls to action. In fact, they are echoes of the UN's founding pledge to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. A veto should never be a verdict against humanity. Madam President, across the world, the UN's authority and legitimacy are being tested. Selective adherence to international law, disregard for Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, deprivation of funding, attacks on peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, disinformation that corrodes trust, and over-reliance on unilateral action. For countries like Sierra Leone, this is not an abstract debate. We know what a working United Nations means. At our darkest hour, during one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history, the UN stood by our side. The United Nations missions in Sierra Leone, UNAMSI, one of the largest peacekeeping operations of its time, helped disarm over 75,000 combatants, restore civilian governance, support democratic elections. The Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, both backed by the United Nations, ensured justice and reconciliation. When the United Nations Integrated Peacebuilding Office in Sierra Leone closed in 2014, it signaled something rare in our world: a successful transition from war to peace. We saw blue helmets on our streets. We saw ballot papers returned to citizens' hands. We saw our nation breathe again. When the UN works, lives are saved. When it fails, lives are lost. We must ensure the UN delivers for all And to do so, we must respect and implement UN decisions, protect those who serve under the United Nations flag, invest in prevention and peace building, and reform the Security Council so its authority and legitimacy match today's world. The United Nations cannot protect vulnerable people if it cannot protect its own authority. As a nation, Sierra Leone does its part and contributes troops to peacekeeping missions. We serve as elected Security Council member and offer our experience in peace building to the world. Sierra Leone's story is proof that multilateral solidarity works when it is grounded in trust, mutual respect, and genuine investment in national ownership. Madam President, peace is inseparable from development. In Sierra Leone, our medium-term national development aligned with the SDGs and the African Union's Agenda 2063 prioritizes people-centered growth. We are transforming our agricultural sector to ensure food security. We are investing in a digital economy that fosters inclusion and innovation. We are deepening investment in human capital development through free quality education and in healthcare, particularly maternal and child health. We are expanding renewable energy to support industrialization and climate resilience. Climate change is an existential threat to Sierra Leone. Our greenhouse gas emissions are negligible, yet our people and our wide coast bears the cost through erosion, flooding, and pressure on food systems and fisheries. We have mainstreamed climate adaptation and strengthened disaster preparedness. In fulfillment of the commitment made at the Third United Nations Oceans Conference, Sierra Leone has ratified the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, BBNG. As the 60th state to deposit its instrument of ratification, Sierra Leone is proud of the collective endeavor to trigger the entry into force of the BBNG Treaty, a historic milestone for multilateralism and the collective stewardship of our ocean commons. We urge all countries to do the same, so the high seas and areas are governed by common good. Climate justice is not charity. It is a legal and moral responsibility. If the poorest are left to pay the highest climate price, there is no justice. Developed nations must honor their commitments, $100 billion per year in climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. We welcome the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change, affirming states' obligation to prevent environmental harm and to protect future generations. In that spirit, Sierra Leone is proud to present the candidature of Professor Dr. Charles Cherno Jallow to the International Court of Justice, a distinguished jurist and tireless advocate for the rule of law. We respectfully solicit the support of all member states in the November 12 elections this year. Madam President, as chair of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, I proudly note our community's 50th anniversary. For 5 decades, ECOWAS has embodied regional integration and collective security, often acting decisively when others hesitated. ECOWAS moved early in Sierra Leone's peace process before and alongside the UN to end our civil war. It has done so in Liberia, the Gambia, and elsewhere to defend democracy and stabilize the region. These are African solutions to African challenges, open to global partnerships anchored in regional legitimacy and trust. Partnership with Africa must move from promise to practice. As chair of the ECOWAS Authority, I recently embarked on a regional tour, including a second visit to Burkina Faso in 2 years. This was to demonstrate solidarity and build trust between ECOWAS member states and the Alliance of Sahelian States. I commend the leadership of Burkina Faso for its willingness to engage and I look forward to continued dialogue with the leadership of both Mali and Niger. In my role as chair of the ECOWAS Authority, I have placed emphasis on advancing and safeguarding democratic governance with a strong commitment to upholding constitutional order and reflecting the people's will. Countering terrorism and strengthening our regional security architecture, including operationalizing the ECOWAS standby force and implementing counterterrorism strategies. Enhancing economic integration by promoting trade, liberalization, developing cross-border infrastructure, and advancing towards a common ECOWAS currency. Strengthening the credibility of institutions through reforms that promote transparency, efficiency, and service focused on citizens. We urge the United Nations to deepen its partnership with ECOWAS and other African regional mechanisms in the spirit of Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter. Africa is not a problem to be solved. Africa is a partner to be empowered. Madam President, during Sierra Leone's tenure as elected member of the Security Council 2024-2025, we have highlighted the urgent security challenges in West Africa and the Sahel, where terrorism and violent extremism transcends borders and destabilize the entire region. However, Africa's lack of permanent representation continues to hinder the Council's ability to act decisively and contextually. We have advocated for a comprehensive approach to counterterrorism in the Sahel, linking security with development, governance reforms, and regional cooperation, and strengthening the UN-AU-ECOWAS partnership. Too often, however, the Council's response has been hindered by narrow geopolitical interests, delaying action that could have saved lives. Our experience confirms a clear truth. Lasting peace requires inclusivity, ownership, and legitimacy. The Council's structural imbalance undermines its credibility and must be addressed to ensure the safeguarding of collective security. Madam President, In my capacity as coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 on Security Council reforms, I speak on behalf of a continent still excluded from the permanent representation on the Council. Africa, home to 1.4 billion people and the largest regional bloc in the United Nations, still has no permanent seat. This is unjust and untenable. It undermines the credibility of the Council and the legitimacy of its decisions. The common African position expressed in the Leone Consensus and SAT Declaration calls for at least 2 permanent seats for Africa with full rights and prerogatives, including the veto, if retained, and 2 additional non-permanent seats. This is not a request. It is a demand for equity. It is a test of UN's commitment to fairness and its own charter. During our Security Council presidency in August last year, we gave this issue unprecedented prominence. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and the 20th anniversary of the Leone Consensus and SAT Declaration, let this be the moment that the international community answers Africa's call. Let us not pass on to the next generation a Security Council reform that fails to reflect the world as it is today. Madam President, the United Nations at 80 must look forward. Sierra Leone stands ready, committed to principled multilateralism, to speaking with independence and conviction, and to working for justice, solidarity, and the dignity of all peoples. Let this anniversary be a turning point, measured not in the many speeches we make here, but service, not in declarations, but in delivery. Let us build a United Nations more representative, more responsive, and more resilient. The world does not need a louder United Nations. It requires a braver United Nations. Now is the time to make the United Nations work for all. Together, let us forge a future of peace, shared prosperity, and human dignity. For in unity, we are not only better, we are stronger. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone.